Hey, let's find our seats so that we can get back to our next session. But I just have to make a plain announcement, okay? If you registered for this event, meaning you told us that you're here, like you didn't just sneak in like a ninja, I will email you Bert's notes. Don't text me 400 texts. Don't send me 400 emails. I don't want it. I'm going to send it to all of you. Don't worry. Don't worry. I'll block you. You're going to get the notes. Don't text. Stop it. Everybody, welcome Burke back to the stage.
And here's the deal. I was looking forward to him getting those 400 emails. He kind of ruined the plan. Oh, well. That's good. Hey, I want to take you back to, by the way, I've had several people come up and all ask excellent questions regarding spiritual implications of the poets and the prophets. And that to me is just a good sign that you're working on stuff, and they were excellent questions. In fact, some of them will probably make me go back and redo a couple of things. Not that we were off, but I could add a little bit that would bring some clarity. Because usually if some people ask a question, there are probably lots of people who haven't. And so thank you for all of that. I've enjoyed the interaction along the way. I want to take you back to the prophets for just a second, to those books that begin with Isaiah and end with Malachi, and just do a quick thing with you, and it'll be in the notes. And since now everybody's going to get the notes, we don't have a problem with that. But I just wanted to see, when we talk about these audiences that the prophets spoke to, if we use the exile was a time when Babylonia conquered Judah. Remember I talked yesterday about tribes and how they had a separation, and 2 stayed with Judah and 10 went with Israel. And so when we look at these and we go along the way, the exile is basically Judah-oriented, where Babylonia took Judah into exile. 70 years, their people were Babylonia tried to make them into their citizens. The citizens of Israel, Judah, were pretty resistant, which is typical, and that's good. But anyway, if we work around the exile and look in front of it, God sends a lot of prophetic word to the nation of Israel and Judah, and to a couple of other nations, Edom and Assyria, basically all being warnings. So Israel gets several warnings along the way, and then Judah gets probably the bulk of them. And Edom gets just one, but basically Edom, whenever Israel, when it was all of the tribes, was in trouble, one who always showed up as part of the trouble was Edom. And that's the descendants of Esau. And so God had a special warning for them along the way, that when things happen, they're going to happen to them. It's one of those tough warnings where God basically says, Edom, enough is enough. There are days just ahead when I'm going to blot you off of the face of the earth. Not a good thing to hear from God. So these are all warnings in advance of some judgment. And God always gives warnings in front of judgment. No surprises. Warning, 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 red light warning. Judgment. And then, oftentimes, restitution. Working to get it right. So we have a bunch of them pre-exile. To Israel, and to Edom, and to Judah, of course. I didn't really put them in here. And then during the exile, the focus of the prophetic books is basically on Judah, with Ezekiel and Daniel. After the exile, there are 3 prophets that function, and their job is to try to keep Judah on track. And those 3 were Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Up here to Judah, though I didn't write it in, it's basically 6 prophets and one attached book called the Book of Lamentations. So if you think of that side, it's Hijjmzl. That gives you those prophets, okay? H for Habakkuk, I for Isaiah, Hijj, Jeremiah, Joel, M, Micah, and N, whoever, and ZL, okay? Zechariah and Lamentations. So anyhow, I just find ways to try to hang on to all of this, and sometimes pieces of it disappear. That never happens to you. No. So there you go. So I just wanted you to see that there's a lot pre-exile. This is the pattern of God. Always to warn, warn, warn. Then finally to say, okay, here it comes. And you have then the exile that's the center post of it, but all of these warnings now take in effect. And then once there's a restoration, then God sends prophets again because they're really just teachers. And the prophet's job after a judgment, and that judgment is fulfilled and God begins restoration, the prophet's job is to keep us all on track. And so that's what they attempt to do, to get things done that need to be done. Haggai relates a lot to the rebuilding of the temple and other things. Zechariah, basically some behavioral issues. Sadly, Malachi at the end shifts much more over to behavior because he begins to see a decline taking place again. So Malachi is a balance between some teaching that's positive and stay on here, but it also begins to take a warning shape again because there's judgment about to become again if they don't make some changes. Does that make sense? These are really complex books. And to do them in 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes, really you get a big picture, but the complexity of them kind of stays lost. They're not difficult to understand, however, if you just understand the big picture. And again, you're all going to get the notes and that'll help. Well, with that, I need to take you over to the 400 silent years. Isn't that fun? In between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have a time frame that often is referred to as the 400 silent years. Also, you'll find lots of books call it the intertestamental period. And it's roughly 400 years long. And by Jewish reckoning, no prophet speaks in the land in those 400 years. Now, if you think about the implications of that, what they think is that God's gone silent. He's no longer speaking. That's a desperate situation, is it not? That doesn't mean that these times were insignificant. And in fact, they're filled with important things. And I want to, in as precise a way as possible, to kind of help you see that. So let's talk powers. And the powers that are going to exist during this period of time are Persia. Persia is going to conquer Babylonia. And when Persia conquers Babylonia, they let the people of Judah return home. So they begin to come back to Judah and to Jerusalem. And there begins a process there that's a restitution process, a rebuilding process, a rediscovering process. So we have these warnings that judgment follows. Judgment comes, and particularly focusing on Judah, they're in exile. Remember that Israel got conquered by Assyria, and the Israelites got scattered all over the Assyrian Empire. The difference is that when Judah got conquered, they kept them together and brought them to Babylonia. So as you might guess, there was more talk about returning home here and more hope here than with the Israel population. But nevertheless, Persia comes along and conquers Babylonia, and Persia then has a foreign policy that they let the conquered people go home. Whoever they are, they can go home. And so lots of people from Judah will begin migrating home under the leadership of Zerubbabel, who'll bring a group back, and Ezra and Nehemiah, and all of those are going to be played out in this section, okay? So this is a very significant time. So we got powers up here, and we start with Persia in power in this 400 years. And Persia is eventually conquered by Greece. I carry all of these pens over here. And then like the child I am, I drop them in the bedroom and forget that I left them somewhere else, So if we go over here to powers and we start with Persia, Persia's in power when the people get to go home. And after Persia, Greece is going to conquer. Now, if Persia had a policy that helped, it's a policy of freedom. They let the conquered people return home and, in a sense, go back to whatever it was that freedom was when they had it in their homeland. And that varied from group to group. Greece offers a bunch of things. Some of them not so good. They offer a whole bunch of religions. They offer a whole bunch of philosophies. They offer things that can mislead people all over the place. And a lot of those things that Greece offered are still around, aren't they? People still study many of those philosophical approaches to life. But there's one important thing that Greece gave us, that gave the people then, and that was a language. What happened is that Greece, every place they conquered, they began to introduce the language, Greek, to those people. And over time, what happened in all of the places they conquered is people spoke the language of the land, and people also spoke and understood Greek. See, Paul would have been one of those people. Where he grew up on the crossroads of commerce. And his father was a businessman. I'll leave it that generic. And so he had all of these things come by. He learned the language because he was a Jew. He learned Hebrew. He had that. But he also learned the language of commerce, which was Greek. So when we come to a time when Greek becomes also the language of the Bible and the language of the land wherever he goes, that's going to be a big deal. It's going to help the communication, isn't it? Because where he's going, Greek is, everybody knows their common language, and lots of people, most know at least some Greek. So there's communication that can take place. So remember yesterday I said in the book of Galatia, there's that passage that said that in the fullness of time, God sent his son. And what's happening here in these 400 years is God's filling up the time with the right stuff. So Greece basically is going to be in power here up to about 167 BC, or BCE, however you like to see it. And they are, interestingly enough, conquered by, get this, a group in Israel that mounts a rebellion called the Maccabean Rebellion, and or revolt as it might be. And they responded to a lot of persecution and just the force of basically being forced to become a Greek. And in fact, the Greeks kind of desecrated the temple by putting their gods in the temple of the day. There are just a lot of things that just really turned the people around. And a guy named Judas Maccabeus, fondly known as the Hammer, began to round up a group of people, and they rebelled against this powerful nation, and they won. And for a number of years, from 167 up to about 63 BC, Israel, if we can call it that, is going to rule over itself. But they're not really strong enough to hold it. And if Greece keeps putting the pressure on to try to win this back, and eventually, these rebels need an answer, and unfortunately, they go to this place to try to get an answer. And Rome has an answer for them. They just come and conquer the whole space. And now you're part of Rome. And so much for independence. Well, we have here kind of a restoration of the, if you would call it that, the religion, which includes just that partisan participation in wanting to rule yourself. That's strong, and that's helpful, although it goes away a bit. And Rome comes, and Rome introduces a whole bunch of things. Herodian kings and vast armies. They rule the peace. They bring peace to the land that's been so desecrated by all sorts of rebellions. Unfortunately, when Rome brings peace, they bring it the hard way. And you will be peaceful or else. And you don't want the or else, guaranteed. So they have solutions, but they also contribute something. Roads. They are road builders. They build the intricate systems of their day. We build computer systems that connect everything. In their day, they were the road builder. They built roads between all their major enterprises. All the big cities they conquered, even some of the lesser ones, they connected them with roads, get this, some of which are still used. They were road builders. And those become the roads that eventually a guy named Paul and a bunch of others and the gospel are going to go down to take the gospel to cities all over the Roman Empire. So Greeks unknowingly provided the language, and Rome provided the systems, the internet of the day. To say, we're going to go down these roads and we're going to connect with people. So we have those things going on under the thing of powers. We also have publications. I'm not going to write them all down because I can't spell most of them. But there's a group of publications known as the Apocrypha, and these basically were kind of portrayed as scriptural, as equal to anything else that we might have in our Bible. But the thing was that they had a lot of fantasy in them, really. And a lot of unverified things that just left people scratching their heads. So most of these apocryphal books disappeared. And think of the time we live in and how many books are being posted that relate to like politics going on in America. And no matter from which side they come from, you kind of wonder where the truth is and where it isn't. And that's sort of an apocryphal book, okay? So there are a bunch of those around, and you might guess that because whenever there's turmoil, those kinds of voices arise. And most of them, I think, are well-intentioned, but they don't have all of the data, and oftentimes they create more confusion than help. And so those books mostly never made it into the Bible. I say mostly because some of them are found in the Bible that the Roman Catholics use. So there's a few of those books there. And you could find them, look it up, and you could find them if you wanted to read one or two. You'd go to sleep, but it would be okay. Probably the best thing you could do with them. So we have the Apocrypha, and we have another group of writings called the Pseudepigrapha. I dare you to spell that. The Pseudepigrapha were basically various writings. We would make it the equivalent of like newspaper articles and various things that people wrote in various dimensions. And there was a ton of writing during this period of time. This was a time for the opinion groups, right? Just like our time for the opinion groups, and they existed, and they wrote all kinds of stuff. And some of it's relevant and good for history. Most of it's not very accessible to us, and frankly is not very helpful to our biblical understanding, though it gives us a pretty interesting look at culture of the time. There's another piece that we're all familiar with called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were written largely by people who decided to check out of the Roman culture and go live in the extremes and just be on their own. And known as the Essenes, actually, but we'll talk about those in a minute. And they, of course, left a lot of records of what they did. Records of their communities, records of life there, some of it philosophy and thinking, and those have been surfaced over starting about in the 50s, maybe the late 40s, 1940s. People began to find those scrolls in caves and the like near the Dead Sea. That's how we get the Dead Sea Scroll part. And they were preserved, and they told us a lot about life during particularly this time that we're talking about and what followed in terms of the New Testament biblical era. And the last thing I want to mention, and I'm going through all of these quick, is the Septuagint. If you can't spell Septuagint, just write down LXX, because that's the common abbreviation for Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. So while Paul probably could do Hebrew and Greek, as could others, this became really the language and the Bible of the day. When you read in the New Testament anything about the Bible, there's a good chance that the version being used was the Septuagint, because if you were using it in public like here, you wouldn't use Hebrew, you would use the language that the common people spoke of the day. And the common language of the day was Greek. And this showed up, was done between, in this publication, was done between the second and third centuries. It took a fair amount of time for it to be done, and scholars, that's LXX, basically is the number 70, and history has it that 70 or so scholars worked on this to make it happen. And so this becomes very important, doesn't it, in the promotion of the gospel. All of a sudden, the gospel, as it's known in the Old Testament, and it is there, Jesus says to those who would question him that you question me, but the Old Testament speaks of me. Tells the religious leaders of his day that you question me, but you revere Moses, but Moses wrote of me. So the Old Testament that we think of it is filled with Jesus. And they taught Jesus out of what we call the Old Testament, which is interesting, isn't it? I've started to work on that in terms of how did they do that? It's kind of a fun project. So there were publications that give us some things out of this period, all right? And then there were politics. And the politics involved groups. The first group were the Sanhedrin and the scribes. I'm not writing a lot of this down because now I know you're all going to get the notes. Oh, did I say that before? I guess I did. The Sanhedrin and the scribes. The Sanhedrin were a group of Jewish leaders who were appointed by Rome, 71 of them to be exact, and they had authority over Israel. Rome loved to give the authority to a group in whatever country they conquered. And if they could trust the group, then they let people from the primary group in the land become the leaders, the judges, the mayors, and the governors, and all of those things. And as long as those people did what Rome wanted, they could stay in power. So guess what all of these Jews that were part of this Sanhedrin did? They did what Rome wanted. They became more Roman than Jew. And so there's a tension that grows between another group. This group is generally young and scholars of the Jewish heritage called the scribes. And the scribes who worked in that arena became deathly against the Sanhedrin. And they became the publicists, as it were, doing anything they could to somehow turn that piece over. So even in the day when there wasn't radio and there's not television and there's not all of those things, we still have that. We had this contest going on between those who wanted to please Rome so everything stayed good, and those who recognized what Rome stood for and wanted to overthrow them. Of course, that's a dream a little bit, because Rome's going to be a challenge to overthrow, isn't it? But there are those. So Sanhedrin and scribes. Another piece was the temple and the synagogue. The temple and the synagogue. The temple was the site of the formal religion of the day for the Jews, filled with priests and all sorts of people who did the work. But they too, in order to keep in their place, had to please whom? Rome. And so they became almost just figureheads. In terms of their religious impact on the community, it was minimal. They served the process of rituals. The rituals had less and less meaning during this time. They sold themselves out. These are the people who, in the story of the Good Samaritan, saw the man in need along the road and walked by. They don't want to have any part of that. They're just too good for that. And against the side of that is that you have the synagogue. And the synagogue would be like RiverLakes. It served a local community. It was headed by a pastor, so to speak, a priest. And the priest was usually a local. And they loved the Jewish religion, and they loved the God of the Old Testament, and they had dreams of what they were going to be, and they preached what was there for the day without watering it down to please Rome. And so you can see the tension, can't you? Temple, got to keep it cool. Synagogue, no, we don't. No, we don't. We've got to minister the people in the way God called to us to minister. Big formal religion, grassroots religion. Got it? That's part of this time. We have the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, I know you've heard of them. If you've read about the life of Christ, you've got these words. The Sadducees served in the temple. They were temple servants. They formalized the religion. They resisted anything that would change that. And therefore, the Sadducees joined the group that really disliked Jesus, as they saw Jesus as a huge threat to who they were and what they stood for. Many of the priests were part of that time. Some of them were even part of the Sanhedrin, the ruling group that we just mentioned. And then there were the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were the conservatives of the time. If you think Sadducee, think liberal. If you think Pharisee, think conservative. And their job and their role, they thought, was to preserve this scripture that was so important to them. So every Saturday, every day that they were in operation, they preached from the Old Testament. And they preached whatever was there. And in general, they were a pain in the side of those who ran the temple. And obviously, they were a disturbance to Rome. But leave it to the locals, right? That's a good thing. And then there were the Herodians and the Essenes. Herodians and Essenes. The Herodians were those now general Jewish population who said, okay, we'll join Herod, which means we're going to be part of Rome. We're going to become Romans. So there was that element in the public. And the Herodians, oftentimes, they were political supporters. Many of them were household members of the Herodian dynasties that existed. They served the politics of the day. And the Essenes were, let me make sure that I don't lead you astray. The Essenes were those who basically said, you know, we're not going to compromise. And because if we stay connected to the culture, we're going to be forced to compromise. We're going to leave the culture. So they left the culture. They disappeared. They went into the wilderness. They built their own places in the caves and wherever. And they just separated themselves completely. And we talked about that when I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then last I want to mention it, and this isn't a solid group of people, but I'll mention it anyway, is there were also philosophies of the period that became a challenge. And some of those pre-Christian philosophies were basically ancient Greek kinds of philosophies, Socratic kinds of philosophies, classical Greek, Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism, Epicureanism, just about every ism you could think of. And all of those had an impact. And I think part of what was going on is you now have, I think this is the most important point I want to make out of this, is that you now have, as it were, a spiritual warfare going on. And you're moving toward a time when God is going to intercede into the life of Judea, into the life of the Jewish population, and beyond the Jewish population into the life of the world through a Messiah that's being expected. At the same time, you have the ruling powers frenzied to, in fact, stop that. What we don't need is another king. What we don't need is these Hebrews all riled up causing problems. And so you have this tension around all of these things. People trying to protect things that they've been given, powers that they've got, all of those. And other people saying, no, we're in the business of creating a situation in which we can welcome the Messiah. Because the last piece I want you to write in your notes is the word anticipation. This is a season, as it were, these 400 years of anticipation. Well, I'm going to wrap this up. This is a lot of talk, but I didn't know how to get at it any other way. It's a lot of things going on. And I'm going to take a risk here this morning, but it's not a real big risk. I have found a helpful tool to look some of this stuff up, as long as you're wise about using it, is actually to use the various opportunities of artificial intelligence to go there. This time around, I had a couple of questions, and I don't usually use it, and I went there, and they not only gave accurate history, as far as I could tell, but they made references to some excellent texts that were great follow-up works. So with due diligence, because there's a lot not to trust, it can be of help to you. And this was one of those areas where I felt like they did a good coverage that I wouldn't otherwise have found very easily, is in this arena of the 400 silent years. Anyway, if I could wrap this up, the silent years I would wrap up this way, that they were a fight for Hebrew identity. These 400 years that the Jewish people, they fought to retain the identity of who they were. They lost it in the exile. When they returned home, they didn't always do great, but they didn't want to lose their identity. And so the fight was on. And it was against anything that might steal their identity. And we already identified some of those things. And they did just all sorts of things to keep it. Of the day, and I think I probably skipped over this group, there were a group called the Publicans, not the Republicans, but the Publicans. And they were a group that politically sided with Rome. And there was another group called the Zealots. And the Zealots was a group that definitely didn't side with Rome, and in fact went about the business of oftentimes executing Roman officials. And the Zealots, oftentimes in a crowd would carry a dagger, and when the crowd was thick and there was a Roman official there that was handy, that guy was probably dead. So you had these extremes grow out of this time. You take this and you sort of have conservative groups on both sides of a question, and then you have more liberal and more extreme all along the way. And that shouldn't surprise us, because we see that all the time, even in our own world. That's how this worked. I picture the disciples now. And we have a disciple, Matthew, who was a tax collector. He was a Herodian. And we have a disciple, Simon, who was a zealot. He went about exterminating Herodians. I'll bet they had some interesting business meetings, don't you? It just said, when you look at the disciples, Jesus chose them from all walks of life, didn't he? And it surprises us in terms of the life change that all of these people, that zealot had an ambition that was, once it was aimed at the gospel, I'm sure it just carried the gospel like crazy. And Matthew had an understanding of the Roman culture that no one else could have, because he tried to please the culture. And God called him out of that for a reason, I think, because he brought a lot of wisdom to the team. So you can see in this, I hope you will see, that the reach of God into the assembly of people, including this assembly, is not a uniform reach. He is calling people with all sorts of jobs, all sorts of inclinations, all sorts of interests, all sorts of experiences, and all of those pieces bring dynamics to the gospel that are needed if we're going to reach the world. And that's what Jesus did with his disciples. So you have the fight for Hebrew identity, and then the other thing you have is just the conflict really within the Hebrew culture between those who want to compromise, let's just compromise and everything will be okay, keep Rome happy, and those who want to separate, including the extreme Essenes who just go, we don't want to be part of any of this, we're just going to disappear. And we have Christians like that, don't we? We have Essene groups of Christians who say, just don't bother us with the culture. I don't know how you make disciples if you don't go into the world and make them. But I understand sometimes the wish of being out of it. And I think you do too. That's the 400 silent years. It's anything but silent. It's an amazing, and what it's pointing to is everybody begins to have a great sense of anticipation. That word you need to remember with this. That something is going to happen, though not everyone is sure what's going to happen. And so this is just one of those delightful transition times. Well, we need to transition as I look at the time at 9:55, and we're going to take a break. Break time. See you in 10, 15 minutes, okay?